So in fact, go ahead and begin recording. And you'll see when throughout this, I think it will show on your screen that the person talking is Peter Fiala. That's only because we use Peter's login. We have one login for our account on GoToWebinar, so just ignore that. It's me, and of course I'm here with John Keycaver, our lobbyist. And yeah, John.
Okay, thank you, Stephen, and thanks for joining us, everyone. Good afternoon. This is the last of the three-part webinar series that we're presenting on advocacy. This one focused specifically on the state budget. With all of the federal developments lately, that we're all interested in, and I'll have in the back of our minds, what we're talking about here today is strictly the state budget process. And after we talk about the process a while, I'll get into, and you can certainly feel free to ask questions about the specific the state budget that we are in the midst of right now. This is a timely presentation in that we will soon see Governor Walker's executive budget later this month. But let's get going. And, the title, Don't Be Baffled. Well, the budget process, certainly true with federal as well, but the state budget process, has a reputation, I think, of being very complicated, being inaccessible in a way, or figuring out what's in it and why and how. I think that's just a matter of the fact that there are several stages to the budget process. Much of what we talk about will sound familiar today, in that if you were listening in on the first of our webinars about the non-fiscal legislative process, much is similar to the state budget. There are a number of distinct phases, and each has its own decision makers and rules and so on. So I think that's what really drives sort of the confusion about the state budget. But once you learn the steps and you learn who's who, you learn the important committees and so on, it's really not overly complicated. And I think you'll find you deal with it a couple of times, you'll become very adept at it and be able to at least find out what's going on quite easily. So in addition to process, though, we'll talk about some advocacy tips specific to the state budget as well.
Yeah. So.
Okay, go to the next one.
Yep.
Just a few main points, and we'll get into each of these as we go, and then I'll mention them again at the end. But the budget process is a long process. It's almost continuous, really. We in Wisconsin have a 2-year state budget, so that you'll hear referred to as the biennial state budget. The fiscal year, just a basic point, runs from July 1st to the end of June. So, for example, as we talk later on about the budget that's being developed right now, that will begin on July, assuming it's done on time, but I think it will be. That'll actually go into effect July 1st of 2013 and will be and is in effect for 24 months. So that's the budget process. That's the fiscal year. It doesn't follow the calendar year. Now that can actually complicate some things if you're depending on what you work on, grant cycles often on the calendar year, things like that. But what we're talking about with the state budget is fiscal year, July 1 to end of June, 2-year state budget. That's one of the differences with the federal budget, for instance, which is a single year. So it is a long process. It really is. Once you start hearing about it in the media, it's frankly well along. The process is well along. At least 18 months actively. Once you get into the budget, and if you work on budget advocacy, you'll see really at least 18 months where you're actively trying to influence, or you're trying to analyze what has been put into effect by the budget. And so that really speaks to getting involved early. And I've been doing this work for quite a few years. I still encounter many organizations and many others, and myself sometimes I'm reminded that it's very important to keep in mind to get involved very early in the process. If you're able to do that, you stand a much better chance at making your case, having the time to perform whatever due diligence you need, and so on. Just keep that in mind to start as early in the process as possible, and we'll talk about the specific stages of the process in a minute. The next point, as with other legislation, is that there really are a number of distinct stages. Now, you'll hear me repeat that a lot. That's important because that helps you target your advocacy. Nobody has time to talk to every legislator in the Capitol and the governor and so on. You just really need to focus on the people who are making decisions about that particular bill, in this case, the budget bill, at a particular time. And so it's really to keep in mind for the purposes of targeting your advocacy work. Once you understand that, it becomes much more doable, and it's not quite so daunting of a process as well. And it's also important to keep in mind because once one of those stages is over, it's over. With the case of the state budget, it goes back to the governor, as you'll see in a bit, for vetoes and signature. But once he's released his executive budget bill, that's done. So you've missed it. If you've missed it, you've missed it. That's another reason why this is so important to understand these individual stages. And then each stage, represents an opportunity to have an influence, to influence the budget, whether it's to amend something that's in there, to get something put in, to get something taken out, whatever it might be. Now, that's also important to understand because, as I just mentioned, for instance, the budget bill comes back to the governor. It's going to these various parties at different times in the process. So just because an item that you're interested in is in the executive budget bill, for example, at somewhat the beginning of the process, doesn't mean you're done. Doesn't mean your work is finished. It's going to move on, as you'll see, to other parties, and you've really got to continue your advocacy work at that next stage, the next stage, and so on. There's just a graphic which shows the major steps in the state budget process, and we'll be talking about each of these in a moment. But just very briefly, state agencies are an integral part of the state budget process. And I would say if there is a step or two that people forget about, it's most commonly forgotten about or ignored, unfortunately ignored, or to the folks' detriment, this is one of those. Advocacy with state agencies around budget items is critical to the process because they will be putting together their budget requests, and that really starts off the process. I'll talk more about that in a second. But then it does go to the governor for, in this case, his executive budget bill. A very important committee, the Joint Finance Committee, then takes its turn. The budget bill will go to each house for their individual versions of the budget. On occasion, a conference committee might be required. We'll talk about that as well. And then it comes back to the governor for signature or vetoes, typically end vetoes. And then there's a potential for overriding those vetoes. That happens very rarely. All right, back to state agencies. So this is really the first sort of concrete step in the process. And as you'll see there with the dates, with the development that we're in now, developing the budget that we're looking at now, which will go into effect, as I said, July 1st of 2013, as you'll see, we're already well along in the process. State agencies started putting together their budget requests, their plans for their own agency, that is, typically spring, late winter even for some, but spring and summer of the even-numbered year, in this case, 2012. So the existing budget was, in place, will be in place until the coming end of June, but they really had to start putting together their plans, their fiscal plans, budgetary plans, which obviously is very closely connected to program, last summer at the latest, because those are to be submitted to the administration, that is, the governor, essentially, you should always think of the Department of Administration as really keyed in with part of the governor's administration, really. So those budget requests are submitted to the governor essentially, and the Department of Administration by mid-September, September 15th, in this case of 2012. Just briefly, one more quick thing about the agencies. So if you know, once you know that, and if you work on a particular program, for instance, certainly we here at WCASA work with the Department of Justice on things, the Office of Justice Assistance at times, other agencies. So you want to be engaged with those agencies at that point in the process, early on, because if you have something that you want funded or increase in funding for something, if you obviously if you get it written into that agency's budget request, which head off to the governor, you're engaged at that point. You stand a much better chance of getting that in the end than if you have to sort of get something added in later on. So just the key to remember throughout this process is the earlier you get your items of interest in, the better. You become part of the budget as it moves along, the better. Then those agency budget requests are compiled by the Department of Administration in the fall, combined with revenue estimates, right? Because a budget, like any budget, although the state budget is different than most of our budgets, but you still have a revenue side and a spending side. And so in the fall is when those two sides of the budget start coming together for the first time. And the Department of Administration puts revenue estimates in together with those agency budget requests, and you start getting a picture at that point of what that next budget is going to look like. The governor takes that information, typically over the late fall to in winter, puts together the executive budget bill, required to be released by the governor. I believe it's the last Tuesday of the month or fourth Tuesday. Forget what the statute says exactly, but this year, for instance, it's January 29th. Now, sometimes that's extended into February if there's some big revenue change or a federal development that will impact the state budget, which has definitely been the case the last few years. You might not see the executive budget bill until February, but generally late January. Now, just something to keep in mind when you're thinking, have this time frame in mind, you realize that when a governor is then first elected, so take Governor Walker's election last budget in November, they're really pulling together their executive budget bill very, very quickly. And I think we saw some impacts of that in the last budget, and I don't think it's too controversial to say that. I know the administration has stated as much as well. There's not a lot of time. Well, this is debatable, but there isn't always a lot of time to vet things or to leak things out slowly and get reaction, that kind of thing when a governor is first elected. Then now they're, in this case again, the Governor Walker's second budget, there's a much longer time frame for the development of that budget. This budget, for example, is basically already written, and we see pieces of it being sort of vetted and leaked out there.
And I have a question I'll jump in with, and it almost seems then that in looking at the timeline and sort of the processes you've been painting it in, if for instance you're an agency of working with your with a state level agency, like you mentioned, example partnership with DOJ or OJA or DHS, that even if we've been developing that relationship and have a dialogue going about something and we're on the timeline, we're getting it in a timely manner so that it's part of their request that they forward on to a governor. If you've got a new incoming governor, that could stymie that whole process. In other words, whatever's stuff might not get communicated. So you want to take
Sure.
that into account in your timeline or in your strategy as an agency in terms of where you put your effort and the timing of things if you're looking 2 to 3 years down the road.
That's an excellent point. And just as when there are new legislators, and we have a new crop again this time of legislators, there certainly was a very large group of new legislators 2 years ago. You've got to build relationships. You know, if these people are new to you, you've got to do all of that. And that's an excellent point, Stephen, because you never want to assume that communications are happening from one official to the elected official to the next, even. You know, even if it's someone from the same party, even if it's from, you know, there are agencies, and then there are, you know, like DPI and DOJ, where the heads of those agencies are elected officials in their own right. They're not appointed officials, right? So a lot of times people make mistakes of thinking, okay, well, they're both Democrats or they're both Republicans, so they're all going to be on the same page. We're constantly assuming that conversations are happening that maybe aren't happening. So I'm glad you brought that up. It continues to I continue to see examples of that. We often think policymakers are talking to each other, or they're on the same page, or even if they disagree, they're aware of each other's positions, and that's just often not the case. So that's a good point.
And just to extend it, that it therefore, to me, it speaks to the idea of strategic planning as an agency, and this sort of touches back to the previous webinar. But there may be a change we really want to see affected, and gosh, we'd really like to see that happen now. But when we look at it realistically, we might realize that we're really talking about a 2 to 3 year timeline initially. And then when we start factoring in elections and all the different players, we might actually say, we've really got to start now gearing up for something that's really going to be a change 5 years from now or 3 years from now, or that could extend because of all of these different factors.
That's a good point. And not just all of these factors, but part of that, but then in addition to that, just sort of the overall education effort that often has to take place for something to become law.
Right.
I mean, I'm constantly telling people, it's making a new law, writing a new law is a big deal. And if you work in an area for a long time, you kind of take that for granted a little bit. You have ideas on what certainly should happen, and you believe in it strongly, and so on. But for example, drafts of bills often take several sessions before they're passed. And it might just be that, sure, you've got these new people to deal with sometimes, but it might just be that you haven't fully set the stage for something to happen. You haven't created the environment in which enough people believe that it has to happen, things like that. Yeah. So late January or so, we should see the Governor Walker's executive budget bill, maybe into February, but I don't see any reason this year why that wouldn't come out in late January. And that, again, will be the first sort of, full budget bill at that point. That's the budget bill. That's the first compilation of the revenue estimates and spending. Then it goes to a very important stage of the process, the Joint Finance Committee. The Joint Finance Committee used to be considered, by the way, a real model nationally. Many states don't have an entity like this, where you have members of both houses on a budget writing committee. There are more than that used to have it, but for a while, Wisconsin's JFC was really considered sort of a model. Now, there are 16 members, 8 from the Assembly and 8 from the Senate, but it's not necessarily equal in party representation. In other words, the majority party controls. So if Democrats had a majority in the Senate and Republicans in the Assembly, you would have 8 and 8. But for instance, now one party controls both houses. The Republicans have a majority in the Assembly and the Senate. So there will be more Republicans than Democrats on the Joint Finance Committee. And in fact, it's 12 and 4. So there are 6 Republican Assembly members, 2 Democrats, 6 Republican senators, 2 Democrats. Wow. So there's 6 and 6 Assembly to Senate, which is important because remember, the bill's going to go to each of those houses. Oh, sorry, eight and eight.
8 and 8, yes.
Yeah, thank you. But it's not equal representation unless the parties control, each party controls one of the houses. So many important things happen during their part of the process. One very useful step, and I always look forward to, are what are called state agency briefings. They're not public hearings yet, but they're public though, and you can watch them on Wisconsin Eye or you can attend them. But what happens over the course of a couple of days, few days, are each agency head comes in front of the Joint Finance Committee and basically explains the main points of their part of the budget. So if you're interested in just taking WCASA again for an example, the Department of Justice budget, maybe maybe health services, maybe Office of Justice Assistance, you can go and you can listen, and Joint Finance Committee members ask them questions. There's back and forth. So those are very useful just as an information gathering, because sometimes, when we're talking about these budget bills, the actual written document, we'll talk about this a little bit later about how to tease that apart a bit or how to know what's actually in there. But these are, last year's budget, I think, was 1,345 pages, something like that. So you need to find ways to help you get through that document, basically, and help. Then there are many things, many that we'll talk about. This is one of them, as a way of weeding through all that and getting to what's in there that you're interested in. Then public hearings are held. Now, these are typically held in several different areas of the state, 5, 6 maybe. The committee will set a plan for this, the Joint Finance Committee. Members of the public, they are public hearings, so anyone can go and testify. They're typically all-day affairs, hundreds, if not thousands, sometimes it seems, people at these. But it is an opportunity for advocacy. I mean, it's really the first opportunity, for first public opportunity. Hopefully this is not your first point advocacy step in this process, but it's the first public hearing opportunity where you can go and make a statement on what it is you care about. There often are so many people. Your folks are limited to 3 minutes sometimes. That kind of thing, but it is a good opportunity to address the Joint Finance Committee directly on issues you care about. And then executive sessions are held. Executive sessions are when a legislative committee is going to vote on something, vote on a bill. In this case, again, over several days, if not a couple of weeks, the Joint Finance Committee will vote mostly sort of item by item or agency by agency. Sometimes you'll get a situation where they have what's called an omnibus motion, which is simply where they put a lot of things together and vote on it as a package. That's just part of the political process and the negotiation process that's going on. Powerful committee, well, for all the reasons we just stated, they're the legislature's first sort of take on the budget, and they will work through a lot of issues that then subsequently each house doesn't have to work through, if that makes sense. Now, you always have to keep in mind which party is controlling which, but like I said, in this case that we have now where one party controls both houses, and they have a majority on the Joint Finance Committee, you would expect some similarities in where they would end up on some of these issues. So I would say maybe even more than in some instances, the Joint Finance Committee, in their process this time is very, very important to what the final budget version is. Go ahead, Steve.
Question that I'll interject. Therefore, again, thinking back to the timeline and what you mentioned before, the sort of education process that really needs to be in place, educating the legislators as well as your community about these things. Would you say then that as you're sort of plotting out and envisioning that strategy, that the members, any of your representatives that are also members of the Joint Finance Committee, would be your top priority, because it almost sounds like if they are, in other words, you've done the work with the agency puts it in their ask, it gets into the governor's budget request, it goes to the Joint Finance. If it can get through this phase, that strengthens its ability of being in the final version. So, as you're thinking about who you want to talk to in those leading months, is that?
Yeah, that's a good point, Stephen. And certainly, if what you're interested in continues to make it, in the next version, comes out of the Joint Finance Committee version of the budget, yes, you don't want to think you're done, but obviously you're sitting pretty well there, because they are representative of each house, and so that is important. Yeah, a good point though and we'll talk a little bit about this when we talk about advocacy tips too, but right, there's 16 members. So most people in the state, their legislator is not going to be on joint finance, right? So a very good question is, well, what do you do then? And I always recommend people to find out who is on, first of all, you just got to make yourself aware of who is on the committees and who your legislators are. I typically recommend that people always contact their legislator. It's always good to be engaging their own legislator. But then I also think that members of a committee like this, in a similar way that to a chair of another committee, they're really serving, because of that position, they're really serving more than just their own constituents. They're serving the state as a whole. So I think it's completely legitimate and appropriate for people to contact members of Joint Finance, and people do, even if they're not your own legislator, they're not your representative or senator. So I typically recommend that you always contact your own, and that you also contact, and we'll talk about communication methods in a minute, but members of Joint Finance as well. That's totally appropriate. Now, something that the parties typically do is they'll create a system. In the last few budgets, we've had a system where in the majority party, they'll have a buddy system, or they're called what's called a budget buddy. So if you're where a member of Joint Finance may sort of cover a number of other rank and file members, but you're not necessarily going to know exactly who's budget buddy is or something. So I would just recommend going to your legislator. They may already know, they may have that system set up, and they may know, oh yeah, I'm in touch with Senator so-and-so on Joint Finance Committee, so I'll go ahead and relay that, something like that. But so I always recommend, though, like I said, your own legislator and then the Joint Finance Committee members as well. And then it goes to each house. This typically is going on late April, May. They try to get their work done by June because, like I said, the budget is supposed to go into effect July 1st. Often, or since I've been around anyway, it often hasn't, been done on time, but it has lately. There is less non-fiscal policy in the budget than there used to be. That's something folks talk about or complain about a lot. Everything kind of being thrown into the budget. The fact is they do much less of that than they used to. And so there's less of that. And then obviously if one party has a majority, and it's not just, this time the Republicans have a majority in both houses and the governor's office as well. Democrats were in the same situation, 4 years or so ago. So we've had these situations where one party has had a lot of control. That's probably also helped, frankly, get it done on time. Sometimes there are other reasons. Sometimes there are federal funding demands. A few years ago, there was a situation where the budget, some items in the budget really had to be done by July 1st in order to capture some federal funds. Anyway, so it really is try to wrap it up by end of June. And effectively, the majority party in each house is going to be dictating, obviously, what comes out of that house. Mm-hmm. I mean, so much so that, in fact, in a couple of occasions in the last couple of budgets, the minority party has basically not even come up with a version or really come up with many proposals. Now, you could, that may or may not be the best way to go about things, but it's obvious though that the majority party does dictate what is in that House's version. Depending on which party is controlling what House and so on, or even not, each House's version could be quite a bit different than the Joint Finance Committee. You don't know. There sometimes are different pressures on individual, rank and file members that sort of may not have come to bear on the Joint Finance Committee. It just depends on a number of things. You just have to be aware, as it goes on. Sometimes those versions of the budget will be very, very similar to the Joint Finance Committee's budget. If the Senate version is much different from the Assembly version, or for some other sort of very specific reasons, there might be a conference committee that's formed. We haven't had one of these in a while. If one party controls both houses, there's much less chance of needing a conference committee. You might hear of conference committees at the federal level. This happens a lot, where they have to work out differences in a bill in the House and in the Senate. There are other instances that could trigger a conference committee, but they're pretty rare. So it would, for instance, this, with the development of the budget that we're starting to see now, it would be pretty surprising to me if there was a need for a conference committee. I mean, one party controls both houses, and the governor's office currently just probably not going to have the need for a conference committee. And then it goes to the governor for signature and vetoes. The Wisconsin governor has very strong veto authority, not as strong as it once was, but it is still very strong line item veto power. Not all that long ago, governors were basically creating new sentences by vetoing out single letters and words and parts of sentences. And, I think it's fair to say pretty questionable way to legislate. The courts reined that in somewhat, but it is still a strong veto power. It's not as if they approve it all or deny it all. There's some room there for change. And there have been some instances lately where that's been pretty important. And this is another place I want to really recommend that you sort of don't forget that this happens. In other words, that you don't forget that this is another opportunity for advocacy. There was there were a couple of items in the last budget where the governor changed, were in the budget, which came from the governor to begin with, but a number of things changed in the ensuing months. And I know I recommended to a couple of groups that they go back and continue to advocate with the governor. And in fact, they were vetoed out just because there were some things that changed. Some education had gone on that it wasn't time for before. So you always have to keep in mind that this is another potential place for advocacy. And it's one in addition to the agency advocacy that I mentioned earlier, the state agency advocacy. This is sort of the second one that people forget most often. You make assumptions. Okay, well, they're done with their part of the process, so why would you possibly, need to spend any time on them? It can be very useful if you continue to advocate with the governor's office. And as I alluded to, the legislature can override a veto, but it rarely happens because it requires a supermajority vote, not just a majority vote. So those are very rare. Just briefly on vetoes, there are typically several dozen vetoes. Even if it's not something that catches the media's attention a lot. For example, this last time there were about, I think, 50, technically there were 50 vetoes that Governor Walker made in the budget. And that's despite the fact that the budget first comes from him, and then in this case went to members of the same party in the majority. Like I said, a lot of things can change. And sometimes the legislature and governor, even if they're from the same party, don't agree. So you got to keep up your work, because vetoes will be made. Just to reiterate these main points, very long process. As Stephen has alluded to a couple of times, that should really go into your whole thought process around planning, advocacy planning, strategic planning. It's just critical to have that calendar in mind. It's just every session, every budget, you can witness groups that are really behind the curve and end up losing out, and others that obviously had that time frame in mind and end up being more successful. I won't repeat those. You can read those main points. Before we go on to advocacy tips, a couple of myths, I guess. Although a couple of these aren't fully incorrect, but you can overcome them, I guess. The first is that if there's a budget deficit, or what you may hear referred to as a structural deficit, well, it means then, well, you can't really advocate for any increased funding. There's not going to be any new funding for anything, or new spending rather. Now, this budget that we're getting into now is much different than the previous, I don't know, 5 or 6 budgets, in that we're not starting off with a significant structural deficit or significant deficit. Now, that's a straightforward comment, but obviously a bit more nuanced and complicated than just as I put it. But basically, the state is going to end the fiscal year with a surplus. Despite that sort of on paper numbers, fact, there are a number of constraints and a number of demands on the spending side of our budget, which has certain items sort of always increasing. The money spent always increasing. So for healthcare, for instance, healthcare costs continue to rise, of course, even if new people aren't being added to the Medicaid rolls. The costs are, so you have items that continue to cost more. So even this year, where we have technically a surplus heading into the budget, you will hear from some people, and you may hear from your legislators, well, there's just no new money for this. There's no, and that's just, you can just kind of expect to hear that sometimes. Even this year, you may hear that from some people, but that's not how the budget's put together. If you make if you have champions and you make believers out of legislators, and they want to do something that costs some money, they're going to do it, and they'll find a way to do it. That's just the way it works. And we've seen that in every budget, even these several past budgets where we've had a pretty significant structural deficit. There have been either new programs where money has been spent on those, or existing programs where more money has gone to those. It's just the way it is. As I said, this budget is different than any of our sort of household budgets here. Second point, I think we talked about this already. There's a reputation that it's a very complicated process, or that it's very insider based, and there's no way to sort of engage that process. And that's just not true. Again, every budget we see typically groups of people, banding together, advocating for something. You just have to learn the process. You just have to spend some time learning the process and the decision makers, establishing some relationships, and you can be successful. Part of the reputation too on advocacy in general is that you have to spend a lot of money, or you have to have a lot of lobbyists to be effective, and that's just not true either. As a lobbyist, I won't totally discount their value, but that is a bit of the myth surrounding not just state budget, but about government in general. Again, we see examples every legislative session and every state budget where individuals are, typically, again, in a group or somehow banded together on an issue, and we've seen them be effective. Now, we talked during the first webinar about advocacy on legislation, non-fiscal legislation, and many of those things apply. As far as relationship building, as far as your approach, as far as how you view yourself in the process, all of that applies. I'm just going to go over a few basic advocacy tips now. The first, even though, as I just stated, you don't always want to take it as the last word when someone says, well, there's no money to be spent, so don't ask for anything. You don't want, that's not the end of the conversation. But you do need to understand, I think, what the state's fiscal situation is. The better handle you have on state finances, not just the budget process, but the state's current finance and financial situation, the better off you'll be, and you'll be able to have some substantive conversations with legislators when you hear things like that. It just will go a long way and sort of legitimizes your when you're asking for something, if you can speak to and you understand the situation the state is in, because you might believe very, very strongly, excuse me, and be expert in the issue that you're going to talk about, but legislators have to take all of it into account, right? I mean, they've got a lot of folks coming in, and they've got a lot of demands, and they know that there are a lot of demands, and there always are a lot more demands than there is funding. That much is true. So you've got to just keep that in mind. Now, don't forget to communicate. Something we talked about during the first webinar, I think, quite a bit. A lot of individuals and even organizations have a capacity, they build up their capacity, their expertise, but they fail to communicate sufficiently with decision makers. And I find that this goes on a lot when folks work on an issue for years, or an organization is expert in their field. You start making a lot of assumptions about what people know and where they stand. And I've seen many groups, I've seen that sort of hamper then, or hold them back from actually getting out there and communicating as much as they need to. So don't forget to actually make the communications about the issues you care about. Budgets can be kind of tense times. Now, you should, in my opinion, always treat legislators and staff with respect, and agency personnel or legislative fiscal bureau staff and so on. It's maybe nerves can get frayed during this process, certainly, and it can be a pretty tense process. It will be appreciated, if you're a positive, sort of productive part of the process. And again, as with any legislative advocacy, you're trying to develop long-term relationships with these people. Get to know them, what their worldview is like, where they're coming from on issues. That's just part of advocacy in general. And then once you know the specific process and the steps involved and who's who, then you target your communications all around that. I don't know anybody who's got enough time or money to be making a lot of mistakes as far as that goes. Mm-hmm. You've really got to target your advocacy work, one, to be effective, but two, just to get to the, you just don't have time typically to reach everybody anyway. Now, questions we get all the time are, is it valuable to send an email? Do I have to have a face-to-face? Basically the question about, well, what's the most effective method of communication? You get a lot of different answers. I know I've given different answers over the years. I actually am still a big believer in letter writing, and I still have enough legislators tell me, well, that's actually going to be something I read as compared to reading every email snippet. But at the same time, excuse me, staff do track when they receive a communication on something, on an issue. They typically do. And if an email is what you can do and what you have time for, you should do it. Basically, the answer is do what you can. Use multiple methods. I mean, I know when I have a meeting, I don't ever have a meeting that I don't follow up with something else, even if they haven't asked for something else. It's just another way of sort of getting in there and engaging.
I was just going to say your slide, therefore, really should be updated because tweets should be added to that. I mean, a number of legislators are now using Twitter. It's become a tool. So I don't know how effective, but why not?
I'm not sure I'm quite there yet.
Yeah.
But you're right, and people do, and I'm probably a little slow. I've been a little slow to adapt technologically. Because just keep in mind, and I keep describing these as relationships, right? But you want to develop trust, and some people don't believe that can even happen. Like that's really not what goes on. But I've seen it over the years, and the more you communicate with somebody in a positive way, the more they'll be comfortable with you, the more they'll trust you. So sure, maybe new methods can be part of that, certainly. But I know if you can have a face-to-face with somebody, I know I prefer that over a phone call, and I prefer a phone call over an email. And so I don't know. I don't know. Twitter is not in my repertoire yet, I guess. But and a very important point maybe is certainly the case with budget items. The budget is basically a bunch of numbers on a paper until people make it sort of real for legislators, right? And on some issues where maybe legislators don't have much experience or just don't know very much, it's particularly important that you describe the real impact of what you're asking for, or or what will happen if you don't get what you're asking for. And again, it's probably especially when it comes to the budget, because it's so, such an accounting process. You've got to, I'd say, work extra hard to get across the personal, real people impact of what their decisions are going to be. That's something that is an advocacy tip in general as well, but I'd say probably even more so when it comes to the state budget. Now, we're getting close to the end of the hour and we're almost done here, but again, the budget can be a pretty daunting document itself. Once you learn the process and learn who's who, understanding what's actually in the budget document itself can be difficult. I mean, it really can take quite some time to figure out where things are and what they mean. It's one little beef of mine, actually. Like, we don't put out, for example, a single document that is a complete summary of our state budget. We put out the Legislative Fiscal Bureau, and you'll see their link there, puts out summaries of each version, but they're really the main items and kind of changes that have been done. And then there's the budget bill itself, which is over 1,000 pages typically. But most people can't read through that statutory language and understand everything. But there are ways to figure out what's in there. And here are a few websites. And I think we can go to these, Stephen, is that right?
Sure.
So let's look briefly at the Department of Administration website. Again, keep in mind, they're really the sort of the budget arm in a way for the administration. So if we can max it out, yep. On the left-hand side of the page, under About DOA, you go several down. There's an Executive Budget and Finance link. Go ahead and click on that, Stephen. And then go ahead and click on State Budget Office. I think everybody should be seeing that, right, as we go. And then back on the left-hand side of the page is a biennial budget link. Pretty intuitive here, but so, for example, they'll list many of the things we've already talked about, right, because we're kind of we're into the process several months. Agency budget requests and revenue estimates that they submitted to the administration in November that I mentioned, those are listed. Prior to that, the agency budget requests from September 17th are listed. So this is one place you can go to read the important documents as they come out. Okay, we can go back to the slide. Let's go to the Legislative Fiscal Bureau website. If you've heard us talk before or have been engaged in advocacy, you know how valuable the LFB is as a legislative service agency. Let's go to the publications link, and then you can go to 2013-2015 budget. They have an overview of which they put together in December, of all the agencies' budget requests, but again, the major ones. So again, that can be every little detail, but it's going to be the major items. As we go through the budget process, this is a place where you can find summaries of the various versions of the budget. So 3 weeks or so after the governor's executive budget bill comes out, the Fiscal Bureau will put up a summary of the executive budget. And they are a nonpartisan legislative service agency, and really the go-to group on telling us all basically what's in the budget, or at least a starting point. Okay, let's go back to the main slide. Now, the state legislature's website, let's go there briefly. We've seen this from our previous webinars, but again, as far as who's who and knowing who's who, the new legislators haven't been seated yet, technically. Inauguration is the 7th, next Monday, but you'll be able to go on here and find out who's on the various committees, for example, including the Joint Finance Committee. So if you go to Joint Legislative Committees on the left, and you go down to Joint Committee on Finance and click that, it'll be an old list, but that's where you'll find links to all the members of Joint Finance. So again, this helps you target your activity, right? And then you can link to each of their web pages and so on. Okay, let's go back to the main site. A couple other real quick sites here. You've probably also heard us mention WisPolitics.com. It's an excellent web-based news site and political site. Let's click on that. Specifically, now I want to mention their budget blog. If you go to the lower right-hand part of the page under Wisconsin or WisPolitics blogs, you'll see budget, and actually that's the one that's up there automatically. During the budget process, the WisPolitics budget blog can be very useful. It's hard for folks to be at every hearing or things like that. They will post information like a blog, as it comes, and is very useful. So you see, for example, the most recent items, and very important, is that in the world of healthcare, is that feds renewed the senior care, basically allowing the state to continue the senior care program. That has budget implications. So this is another excellent site. One more resource, if we go back to the main page, not a plug for my site, but I distribute state budget alerts, which are free. Go to State Budget Advocacy. And so, for example, for this budget period, the first one was on September 5th, when the governor released what his sort of priorities were going to be. So I send these out to folks, and you can, if you email me or call me, and you want to receive those by email, just let me know and I'll add you to the list. A few thousand people get this at this point. It's not an interactive listserv. You're not going to get a lot of emails. You can look at the last budget, the 11-13 budget. From July to July, there were, I don't know, however many are there, 15 or whatever. When public hearings are set and agency briefings or the summaries have been done by the Fiscal Bureau, I send out alerts to those types of developments. If we can go back. And that's all we have. This is our contact information. You should always feel free to contact me or contact Stephen on legislative matters or other issues, advocacy trainings, things like that. As we said, this was the third of a 3-part series of webinars. We'll get feedback on these we'll think about it. We'll talk about ways to enhance them in the future and develop additional ways to reach out to members and others. It's a focus of ours. We're going to continue to focus on that, how to engage people in our advocacy work. So you should always feel free, if you've got ideas about that or comments, to contact us.
At this point, if there are any questions, again, feel free to raise your hand, and we can make sure folks are unmuted. You can also type a question in the chat. So we'll just pause for a moment.
While we're pausing, in case anybody has questions, and while I'm talking, go ahead and raise your hand or type in your question. But I just wanted to make a few comments on the budget that we're going through right now. The fiscal estimates, the fiscal revenue estimates, or the revenue estimates that the state made last year compared to actual revenue collections, right? That's something that impacts how sort of good or bad the state's financial situation is looking, right, compared to what we expected, should continue to be pretty positive. And it's the fact that collections have been higher than projections lately, which has helped create a couple of $100 million or so surplus by the end of this fiscal year. Now, as I said before, there are a number of demands on that money, on any additional money, things like that. But everybody's out there right now. Folks are out there trying to persuade decision makers, policymakers, on their particular areas of interest. And we enter a budget in a much different way than any since I've been around. The first budget I worked on was the 0103 budget, and we've always had a structural deficit, certainly since then. I won't get into the substance sort of how we got here, but the fact is the fiscal situation is a better looking one than in some years past anyway. Now, just a couple of more brief things, I guess, about this budget. I mean, you've probably have all heard the main issues that are talked about, that legislative leaders and the governor has focused on, potential income tax cut as part of this budget, being considered questions of potentially an increase in K-12 funding or not, or a focus on choice and charter programs, perhaps. But there's a lot of big things, big issues in play and being talked about with regard to this budget, that's for sure. Well, I don't think we have any questions, Stephen.
Doesn't look like it. So at this point, we'll go ahead and we will stop recording and effectively conclude this podcast, this webinar. Thank you so much for participating. As John mentioned, feel free to send questions in or call us or contact us at any time. And this podcast will be available as a recording up on YouTube, and the link will be made available through our website. Thanks very much, and we'll see you at our next webinar.